Benedicte, my friends, and welcome to the Time Traveler's Tavern, where we share a mazer or two of mead with witty, intelligent humor to bring light to the Dark Ages and revelry to the Renaissance. I'm your host, Sister Mary Margaret Mead Hall. Welcome back to the Tavern, my friends in pod. I do hope you've had a good month since our last visit. Have you had the opportunity to make some of your own delicious May wine from the Anchoress's recipe? Even though we're in June, our strawberries here are at their peak. If you'd like to make your May wine in June, we certainly won't judge you. It's absolutely delicious. And it does sound like my dear friend had quite an enjoyable visit with that good wife in Bath. I wonder where... Now what? A barn owl carrying a scroll just joined us in the tavern. And is landing next to me. Ew. Somebody get me a mop, please. It takes all kinds, and I have a feeling we might see at least one of each. Let's see where the Anchoress travels have taken her this month. My dear sister in pod, blessings attend you in your good works. Having been healed from the ague, thanks to the kindly ministrations of the good wife in Bath, we have continued on our journey to meet with you. The roads being as they are, we shall break our journey in Norwich to visit with our sister Anchoress, Julian, and there seek her spiritual counsel. Her writings have offered us much comfort. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. It's encouraging to hear when one contemplates this weary world. In our journey, we noticed that lemon balm is growing freely in these warmer months. Balm being a sovereign remedy for melancholy, we have taken freely of a comforting infusion of its fresh leaves. I share with you herewith the receipt. Take the juice of lemon to the measure of 1 cup. Sweeten to taste with honey or sugar, from 1/2 to 1 cup, depending upon your fondness for sweets. The finely grated peel of the lemon may be added as well. Add in a generous handful of the leaves and stems of fresh cut balm. Do you wash and pick them over first, gently bruising the plant as it is stirred in. Stir in 5 to 6 cups of fresh cold water and set to chill. A most refreshing infusion it is, and well suited for these warmer days. We shall see you anon. I do miss my dear sister in pod, but I always love her missives. Well, as I planned to say, we have a fascinating fellow time traveler with us here. Travis Shores enjoys following esoteric rabbit holes. In fact, our conversation takes us down rabbit holes into a veritable rabbit warren. He grew up helping a family member who happened to own the largest metaphysical bookstore on Cape Cod, sparking a lifetime curiosity in books and the occult. His interests led him to research various magical orders and to a study of historical grimoires, also known as books of magic, at Dartmouth and eventually to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. He's made a mark for himself in academic circles, and his research is still cited today. We'll follow the threads of these magical items back into the mists of the ancient world and see how they evolved in the medieval period and Renaissance. Join me as we welcome Travis to the tavern. Welcome to the tavern.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So how would you define grimoire?
They were and are books of magic, both practical and also esoteric, so that, well, I'll simplify. They're books of magic that were printed by hand and by printing press so that people could conjure spirits and do what they wanted them to do. Most of the magical understanding that we have today about, waving a wand and abracadabra, hocus pocus,
Your swish and flicks.
yeah, you're just all outside of all the swish and flick and leviosas that are out there. That all of that culture comes from these books of magic that most people don't have any idea about. And so they really have remained esoteric, known only to the kind of initiated few. So yeah, they have a root. So my whole thing was seeing like the world is full of all of this, swish and flick. Where did it come from? And that's a deep dive backward into a lot of information that most people don't have the time, inclination, or really even care about. But they do care about the end result, which is, can I wave my wand and make something happen? Can I conjure something that does something for me? What is this world of magic? And then for people who have an investiture in any sort of magical order, it's particularly interesting to them.
Pardon my ignorance, first off. What the questions I'm asking are out of curiosity and plain ignorance, so bear with me on this. This all works from presumption that magic is real.
Mhm.
I'm not going to dive too deep into that, but just that's the
Well,
premise to work
yes,
for the basis.
that's a heavy concept by itself. Real to whom and real how? Because even something that is understood to have magical power to somebody else, to the non-believer, can still be a culture of power. So if a government understands that you have people who believe this stuff is real, they can utilize this information to gain power and control over the people who do believe. So from any religioso, nutbag out there to the person who is just, a devout practitioner of their faith, you're going to have somebody who sees that as being powerful in some way or another. And so whether you have a personal belief in it or not, you have to understand that this is something that does affect somebody else in some way, shape, or form. So magic being real, do I have to believe that I can, have power over 72 spirits of the Shemhamfresh to do my bidding? Or, can I just say that I understand that this is important enough to somebody else in order to exact some sort of change?
So regardless, it's powerful. You don't have to believe in it. It's a force of its own.
Absolutely.
Let me back up a little bit. How on earth did you get interested in this topic? I mean, from what I know, your aunt specifically had the largest spiritual gift shop in the Northeast, out on Cape Cod, called Lavender Moon. You had access to a lot more esoteric materials.
Yep. Yeah, my aunt was a very witchy woman, opened up this shop. I helped kind of set it up and would often work in the store to help out with the family. But I always found myself hanging out with the witches of the local coven that she would have there doing tarot card readings or any sort of psychic events, and they would certainly be there also to say what Wicca was at the time period. So Gardnerian Wicca was what they practiced. I think there was somebody there who did Alexandrian Wicca, which is a little different, but essentially they had these magical orders that would be doing all this really cool stuff, and I didn't really know a whole lot about it, so I did a dive into her bookshelves that were all for sale, and I'd utilize her store like a library. So I would go there and I'd read, and then I would say, she's like, "Hey, well, thanks for helping out in the store. Can I give you something?" And I'd be like, "Well, I'm interested in books." So she gave me a few books, and one of the ones I thought was the most important ever, still do, is Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy that was written in 1533, and I think it was reprinted in 1550. That book became the source for everything I studied afterward. And what I did my master's work on was essentially, that. And we can get to that in a second. But so while I was sitting in those reading sessions in my aunt's shop, I started looking around and going, okay, now this stuff connects to Freemasonry, and now I see that a lot of the gentlemen in my family were Freemasons, but they didn't talk about really much about Freemasonry. So
They
um,
can't.
well, they can to a point. And I found, because later I became a Freemason and went up the York Rite in the Freemason lines. And so I did that and saw that most people there didn't understand. There's circles within circles, and there's understandings and different levels of kind of enlightenment, if you will, that happens in a thing like Freemasonry.
So you're saying you follow the threads and kind of connected it all to you unraveled the tapestry, in a sense.
Yeah, I started to, and being a drummer, my undergrad work was all drumming. It was all music all day, every day, and I got into doing folkloric drumming from Haiti and Cuba, and particularly with the Haitian drumming, I had to get into what they were doing with their drumming ceremonies, and in that context, I'd look and they would be painting these cornflower, what they call veves, these pictograms on the ground to conjure their spirits to come and dance with them. And what I saw on the ground looked a heck of a lot like what I saw in some of these books from early, like French Freemasons. And, then when I became a Freemason, I saw it even clearer. So I wanted to find out, okay, how is how is this world of spiritual conjuration uh, connected to these symbols? And where do they come from? Like, how do they know how to do this stuff? Where's the origin point? So that was back to all these books that I was diving through. And I decided to jump back into school and really study it pretty heavy.
So basically, you got into this because you're just kind of insatiably curious and just saw the connections. You just wanted to keep going down rabbit holes.
Yeah, the rabbit holes got pretty dark and I don't know if there's a end to the network of those tunnels, but I found some pretty cool ones and kind of focused myself on particular areas. So me trying to figure out the origin of stuff became kind of my thesis statement to the rest of the world, and it kind of ruffled some feathers. Some people liked what I had to say, and still do like what I say, but some people didn't like what I had to say. And that world is pretty safeguarded by some pretty jealous academics that I've found.
Where did you do your research? If I remember it, it's like the Bodleian Library.
Yeah, I went to Dartmouth as a grad student, and they didn't have a particular program in books of magic, so I essentially created.
Imagine that.
Yeah, but they had people there who had enough on the side to be able to point me there. I had this great professor, Ehud Benor, who he was a Kabbalah practitioner. And so when I had an opportunity to go over to Oxford as a grad student, I did it on two different ways. They had a program to study English literature of Chaucer and Shakespeare, but then also I could do an independent study where I worked in the Museum of the History of Science with Stephen
Oh my
Johnson.
gosh.
So I got to go and
What an
actually,
opportunity.
yeah, that was pretty fantastic. I got to
Gosh.
actually hold in my hand some artifacts that were unexplained. So I helped
Oh my
explain
God.
these artifacts to Oxford, which the people in the museum loved, but the researchers who had worked on it beforehand really tried to blast me out of the water. Like, how dare I come from the States as some nobody Yank to tell them what they had in their library or their collections. And so,
Bit of gatekeeping.
yeah, but what that did for me was it put me on the ground, and I was able to go into the Bodleian and look at some stuff that was not really that accessible to me. But I mean, today it's a lot easier for anybody to jump into this info because everything's digitized now. It used to be that you had to get library permissions and sit there and put gloves on and peel through texts and transcribe them, and you had a limited time in the libraries. But now anyone can kind of go online and look at the work that's been digitized from manuscript form all the way to print form, and it made it a heck of a lot more accessible. So I was able to get a lot more information than scholars would have been able to do even 10 years prior to when I did it.
I do want to get to your favorite recommended resources for further research. Let's hit that in a little bit. I'd like to ask about what documentation goes back to show when the first grimoire was created. I mean, is
Sure. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
connected to like the printing press or?
Well, yeah, that's for some it's a chicken and an egg kind of thing. We have books that we can look at that go back to ancient Greek texts. Other ones that go back to ancient Egyptian as well. People have often really and sometimes spuriously tried to connect the dots of all of the ancient worlds and the oracle texts that are out there that people find on the side of urns and stuff. But in terms of this corpus, I think it's fair to say, okay, these are Solomonic grimoires. So let's just start there from King Solomon. And why are they called Solomonic grimoires? The Solomonic system of grimoires might be different than what you'd see from somebody who's doing herbal magic from Northern Ireland. The traditions change, and they're very different kind of spectrum. So the Solomonic grimoires attributed to King Solomon, and people say, well, okay, why? Was it because he was so pious and God loved him? He was the pure son of King David. David had killed in war, so he was not pure enough to build the temple of God, the first temple. So Solomon was. But then we get into these other texts that are not canonical with any sort of biblical ideology, like we see Old Testament versus New Testament. We have to get back into these older texts like the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sefer Zohar, and the Sefer Raziel, these Jewish texts that talk in depth more about the orders of angels and the different names of God and the different words of power that were utilized from the rabbinical texts that were there. So then the Kabbalists come through. So Kabbalah.
Okay, I was gonna say this because coming back to Kabbalah, it sounds
Yeah,
like.
yeah. Kabbalah is a big thing. And a lot of really devout Jewish practitioners, they don't practice Kabbalah because there was an older tradition that said one son gets the inheritance, the other son gets the Kabbalah. so
Okay.
one was to be the priest, one was to get all the lands and stuff. So they could kind of keep the idea of the relationship of Moses and Aaron together, where one was the leader, the other one was the priest. And so in the Kabbalistic texts, we start looking at, oh, well, there's lots of different words that are utilized here that were I understood as power words. And they looked back at Solomon and said, okay, well, allegedly, Solomon built the first temple without a single stone or tool being heard. And they said, well, how did he do that? Well, if anyone knows the Aladdin tale, Aladdin goes and picks up a lamp that's made of brass, and he rubs the lamp, and out comes a genie. Well, genie is what we call it. They call that a jinn. That's also a demon or a spirit. The same things that are found in these Solomonic texts. Because, again, in these older texts, Solomon sealed up 72 spirits and made them do the bidding of God. And he sealed these spirits up in a brass urn and put the symbol of himself and God on it so that they were bound to do the work that he said should be done. These
Solomon's seal, right?
Solomon's seal, right? And so that
Okay.
in a kind of very basic text would be what we see now as like the Star of David. That kind of two triangles inverted with each other, the six-pointed star. But on a deeper dive, there are these books now that have a seal for every single spirit that's out there that was originally recognized. So you have the Shemhamphoresh, the 72 spirits, which that comes from a series of translations of the Bible in Hebrew, where they pair up three letters to form the names of every one of these 72 spirits. These Solomonic texts took that idea and said, now we're going to look at it from what spirits are attributed to every one of the planets that are out there. So it's a dive through medieval astrology. So you have ones for the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And they all have different attributes for like strength and for, gaining power over your opponent, for being invisible, for being, invulnerable to anything, to gain love. Some of these things are really creepy, like from a stalker perspective, like how to get someone to love you against their will. I mean, it really went down that road. Yeah.
Nice.
So Solomon looking at Solomon as the kind of origin point of a lot of this thinking, then it was like, now we see lots of Hebrew involved in with this and kind of like, Latinized Hebrew, and then stuff that to give it any sort of legitimacy was English words put back into Hebrew, and then written with other kinds of script.
So what I'm connecting here, and tell me if I'm on base with this, is you just described kind of foundations of alchemy.
Oh yeah. So the alchemist, or even the word alchemy comes from the Arabic. So a lot
Oh,
of
never put that together.
yeah, the early ideas of alchemy or alchemy as we see it came from these Middle Eastern texts. And so what you'd find that was originally written in Greek or Hebrew was then translated into Arabic. And so then there's the chicken and egg, which came first, the Arabic or the Hebrew versions. And so there's lots of mix up here and there, and people pointing back saying, this is ancient, this goes all the way back to Solomon. But my work said the corpus of Solomonic texts as we see them today really goes back to Agrippa in 1533. Because my work looked at stuff between 1400 and 1800. And all of the texts that were utilized and quoted from and formed the foundation for a lot of these magical orders, they go back to a system of writing. And I kind of pinned it on this system of writing called Malachim. And
I'm
Agrippa,
sorry, can you spell that so I know?
yeah, Malachim, Malchim.
Okay. No, sorry, never heard the word before.
So it was like there's passing of the river script, there's Malachim script, there's all these angelic scripts that they were called that are essentially distorted versions of ancient Hebrew, but the letters look differently, they're written differently, but they follow the same rules as the ancient Hebrew script.
Okay.
And so none of this script in any of these grimoires, all of these grimoires contain Malachim script. And so there was no Malachim script in any texts really before Agrippa. It's found in the Sefer Raziel, the ancient Kabbalistic Jewish texts, but there weren't any grimoires that contained Malachim script before Agrippa. So the corpus as we know it today of Solomonic grimoires that is out there, what's available to anybody there, with the exception of only a few that are like fragment and weren't really following the same system, they all had Malachim script in them. So we have to look at Agrippa, and we have to say Agrippa originated this Malachim script for the masses. And then they say, well, okay, where did Agrippa learn it? So it must have been his teacher Trithemius that came before. Well, Trithemius being this monk that was brilliant, he didn't have any Malachim script in any of his writings. So Agrippa himself, this guy that makes me feel bad because he did all this at age 20. Back in 1533, he wrote 3 books of occult philosophy, which I'm still looking at, and he was in his 20s. He must have dived through lots of ancient Jewish texts or had some sort of teaching that wasn't printed. And so now we have to say, okay, if everything points back to Agrippa, we need to go from Agrippa forward to understand a lot of these texts. So even though they're
So you
attributed,
found that intersection
yeah, and
at
so they're
Agrippa.
attributed to King Solomon, but they're not that ancient. The information that's in them might be overlaid with other stuff. So you'll have like Hebrew mixed in with ancient Greek, mixed in with Latin, mixed in with, Christian psalms on the outside of some of these pentacles that are formed in there for power. So you have kind of this, mismatch. And then because people were scared of being persecuted, of devil worshiping, they'd make sure that they Christianized it enough so that they could say, oh, no, 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 we're actually conjuring angels of God and Jesus, and that's why it's okay.
Wow.
So
Okay, let me take a jump here because I want to get it back to the
sure.
Renaissance.
Yeah, yeah.
Would these texts have been brought over to, unfortunately, most of the history that we have is focused on Western Europe.
Mhm.
But would most of these like be brought back, this information be brought back on the Crusades, and that's where Agrippa kind of got these ideas from?
Certainly. There's a text that called the Abramelin text or Abramelin. And it basically the gist of it is how to go into the desert and find your own personal holy guardian angel.
Okay.
And Abraham von Worms was the one who was said to be the originator of it. And inside this text, it has these tables of numbers, and they're like kind of magic numbers. And
What date is
depending on
this,
if
by the way?
we're looking back 1200s, I
Oh,
believe.
goodness. Okay.
Yeah, and so Abraham von Worms, if you do kind of a life trip of how he moved about Europe, and I could be wrong with the date on that, but he was found in the Middle East and then back to Germany. So he's somebody who brought things back at that time period. And you had a lot of Jewish communities that would go between the Middle East and Europe that would bring back lots of interesting texts and philosophy and Kabbalah. And so I think it is important to go back to what you said and say, this is the Western esoteric tradition,
Right.
even though it looks at, Jewish and Kabbalistic texts that could be seen as more Eastern. The systems that are in place here are implicitly Western because they were really chewed up by a lot of the communities that had settled in Europe. And then, those communities too were then expelled from Europe at different times periods, especially the Jewish people who were there. But certainly the Moorish that would go into southern Spain, and what trade happened in Italy as well and in Malta. So we see transfers of not just goods and services, but we have trade of intellectual thought and
Oh, yeah.
spiritual thought going back and forth from this time period. So yeah, they certainly could have picked things up on Crusade. I think that's plausible to think that there was lots more than just a knight with a sword that was going back and forth for their holy pilgrimage,
Right.
that there was actually merchants and priests who may have also collected some of this knowledge and said, well, what is all of this and what are they doing? You had more than just people who said my way, the highway. You did have some intellectual thinkers saying, well, what are they trying to get to here? So
Right. My
they would hand
my premise is if we got algebra this way, we probably got more than hopefully just that.
right. And so there's a lot there. But there is something particularly interesting about it, about why it was, so safeguarded the way it was. So my work also looked at why was, basically who are the readers of this stuff? Like, who was the readership? Was it intended for the common practitioner who wants to swish and flick? Or was it supposed to be there for a more educated audience? And I think that the answer is pretty clear, that you had to be able to read Latin because a lot of this was translated from Hebrew into Latin. And then it was a Latin Hebrew hybrid where the Hebrew words would spell out Latin words that were a translation of the Hebrew words. So it got really silly. Yeah.
So you're looking at the upper classes regardless, because you're going to have no one else is going to have this amount of literacy.
Right, right. Or either the upper classes or just an educated religious few. But I think the upper classes would have to be the one to take the lion's share, mainly because if you look at the expense that would be incurred to be able to reproduce these texts, they had, you know, 2, 3 different type of inks that would ink these vellum. They'd have to get vellum in general, which was expensive, and they would be huge books, and they'd be hand done. So even after the printing press came along, we still had people handwriting these texts, and I found that really curious. Like, why, if these were meant to go out and be disseminated among the masses, so to speak, why would they still be penned personally instead of just thrown to a printer who could print out, you know, hundreds of copies way cheaper? And so then it came the question: is the book supposed to be directions for how to do this magic, or is the book's reprinting a practice of that magic?
And that's really curious.
I think both situations are true. So the book is, you know, you'll find like there's clothing that you're supposed to wear, there's incenses that you're supposed to burn, there's blessings of the tools that you're going to be using, there's directions for how to create circles on the ground to stand inside of for protection against malevolent spirits. There's all these instructions, and they're very specific under what hour of the day, what planet is in the sky, makes it so that it can happen. But then while you're doing that, it says, okay, take a piece of parchment and do all this, you know, suffumigation of this parchment, take this ink that's been blessed, create this symbol on this piece of parchment. Now that's going to be a talisman that you wear or hold to show authority over these spirits. Well, what you did was you just created your own book. So while you're practicing this, you're also creating your own book that then somebody else could look at and reproduce by themselves. So it became a
it's basically
practice.
hands-on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it became a spiritual practice just to recreate the book.
So it's hands-on and how-to.
Yeah,
at the same time.
At the same time. Yep.
That is incredible.
You could find that from printed versions that were out there that did go through a printing press. But the idea is that even in the printed versions that came out, they said, find yourself some parchment. So that's why, as late as 1800s, there's a really great book that I have out here that was done by the original one was Ebenezer Sibley and Frederick Hockley. It was their manuscript that then was picked up by Joseph Peterson, who, by the way, Joe Peterson, he's kind of this lay scholar in the Midwest who's probably done the most important work on the Solomonic genre that's out there, period, full stop. His work is extensive to the point where academics love to slam the believer crowd as being spurious and, you shouldn't even pay attention to him. All my people I worked with at Dartmouth and Oxford, they looked at Joe Peterson's work and they just nodded their heads and said, this guy is the best that's out there.
Is he contemporary? Is he?
Yeah. He's out there now. I've actually corresponded with him. He's a great.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he's wonderful. And his work is airtight. It's perfect from an academic standpoint. His command of Latin is beautiful. His command of being able to relate a lot of these manuscripts that are out there, his knowledge is unsurpassed. He's kind of the guy who understands probably this world the most. But that said, he's not weighing in and he's not giving any sort of thesis on correct versus incorrect. He's just presenting it as it is and its relationship to other texts that are out there. He's not taking a stand either way. He's just saying, here it is.
He's just connecting the dots.
Yeah. And so there's a really great book that they did that was from the 1800s that showed that Frederick Hockley got a manuscript from somebody who was previous to him named Ebenezer Sibley, who was actually a doctor in London. And this was in the 1800s. And they were still doing it all by hand. They weren't putting it through a printing press.
That's fantastic. Can you give us some examples of grimoires still existing today from the medieval and Renaissance period? I mean, Agrippa, you mentioned.
Yeah, so 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa is not part of the Solomonic cycle. It's just, I think, the foundation for where they draw a lot of their information to make these Solomonic texts that we know of today. Okay. I would say there are print versions, like the one I mentioned by Joseph Peterson called The Clavis or Key to the Magic of Solomon. There's another one, a really neat one that was actually found in the Folger Shakespeare Library called The Book of Oberon. And that's Dan Harms and Joe Peterson, same guy as the previous book. But in terms of like books that are being used by spiritual groups today, I mean, I stumbled upon the Golden Dawn book long before getting involved with a local Golden Dawn group. And so that's a working grimoire in my
Okay.
is how I would look at it. There are groups that are still using that. I'm not familiar with all the different writings of Gardnerian Wicca or Alexandrian Wicca that are out there, but every group would have a book that essentially that they could use on their own, that could be their own personal grimoire. And anybody who has any sort of spiritual practice where they write down what works for them, what didn't work for them, and prayers, conjurations, magic as they see it, would be considered a grimoire. Solomonic grimoires, though, I think that they're kind of looked at as more of like in antiquity. And the only one I can see that really utilizes the stuff that you see in some of these Solomonic grimoires would probably be the Golden Dawn. They do a deep dive, but the Golden Dawn is based on information that's incorrect, and they've doubled down as an order and says, no, we do this the correct way by combining John Dee and his Enochian magic with ancient Egypt, with this Solomonic grimoires, with the lay hedge witchery of Europe. They kind of became a one-stop for every tradition so that they could be irrefutable. And in doing so, they kind of muddied the water and made it so that it's very hard to follow any sort of lineage track to make sense of what they're looking at. And some of the stuff that was transcribed by Samuel Liddell McGregor Mathers, who was the Golden Dawn founder, was incorrect.
It sounds like you're saying the Golden Dawn combined high magic and folk magic.
They did in places, yeah, and most of it's high magic.
Okay.
But they tried to say, oh, all of it's valid, so let's all throw it into one spot. And especially with John Dee's Enochian magic, I just personally look at that saying that didn't make sense to do that. Dee's angels that he conjured with Ed Kelly are very different conceptually than the Solomonic angels, quote, or slash demons that you might see that's out there. He went for a different route. He became an original source of original information that wasn't really based on any previous tradition. And so because of that, there's kind of this dissonance that happens between the two. And the lower order of the Golden Dawn really isn't getting into that so much. They're looking at planetary magic, the idea of understanding Hebrew and how it works, and kind of like the basis of Kabbalah.
When was the Golden Dawn founded? Does that go back to the Medieval or Renaissance period?
No, it was founded by Samuel Mathers, William Wynne Westcott, and William Woodman in 1888. And they claimed that it had to do with a Rosicrucian connection.
Oh, okay. My goodness, we're getting all kinds of tangents and groups here.
Yeah, so that's what they had. The rabbit hole goes into lots of different caverns off into other offshoots. But basically, Mathers was a bibliophile and would sit in the British Library and pore through these texts and try to translate them. And there's a lot of inaccuracies in his translations. And some of them might be even argued that he did them on purpose to keep the knowledge, the correct knowledge among the initiated few. Then you get in Aleister Crowley, who was a buddy of his, and Aleister Crowley took it in a whole different direction too.
Well, that's a whole nother episode. Goodness.
But yeah, I would say that that's probably examples of like living grimoires that people use today. There was a book that was printed by Israel Regardie called The Golden Dawn, and it was his way of trying to keep the order alive after its dissolution. And it was considered, taboo to write any of this stuff down with the early order. But Regardie said, if I don't write it down, it's going to be lost. So he created this book called The Golden Dawn, which is, it is a grimoire. And I would say that it's particularly Solomonic in its context of how it works, but very Freemasonry oriented as well. It's almost like looking at a more developed version of Freemasonry.
Okay. With all your research, what was the most surprising fact that you found? I know it's hard to narrow down with all the rabbit holes, but what surprised you the most?
Oh, the neat part was looking at Malachim's script, going back to Agrippa, which I had mentioned, but the other piece is that, to think of the conjuration of these angels to come and help you out, or these demons that were there to put under your control, that the idea that they might be one and the same, and that angels and demons might be two sides of the same coin. And
depending on whose interpretation?
Well, depending on how you choose to engage them.
Oh, okay, good point.
So, you can look at something that's helpful to you and call on this spirit, and then look at something that is harmful to you and call on this spirit to kind of keep it away. or to bind it. And that, the idea that these angels that are looked at as in any way utilitarian are also the demons that are there to look to destroy you. So at any given moment, you're balancing malevolence and benevolence in the same way. And I don't know if everyone understood it to be that way, but I got into looking at it through that kind of context and saying, okay, there are elements that are bad and good depending on how you're interfacing with this information. That there's no real intent to these demonic or angelic forces. There's only the intent of the practitioner calling upon the utility of them.
Wow.
And that actually ruffled a lot of feathers, especially when I was doing work at Harvard. I was supervising a grad student at Harvard, and the head of the department I was in, I didn't realize that she had written a book on angels, and I think that it pissed her off. this concept, and it didn't work out well for me as someone who was applying to the PhD program to piss off the head of the department. But yeah, well, the academic world is really jealous and super, super guarded. And I kind of learned the hard way being wide-eyed and really altruistic about my experiences there. But nonetheless, I saw that there was some pushback against this idea, even though there's evidence to show that they may be seen as one and the same.
That is wicked curious. Along the lines of books, can you give us 3 resources that you'd recommend for anyone that wants to take a deeper dive and join you in the rabbit holes? Or just get an overview, I should say, because this is a whole rabbit warren.
Sure. Yeah. Well, from like foundational text to be able to understand what's going on in these books, I would say Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. There's another one by Manly Palmer Hall called The Secret Teaching of All Ages. And then probably familiarizing yourself with Western astrology. So A History of Western Astrology by Nicholas Campion, or The Dawn of Astrology. It's a 2-volume series. But then as far as the actual grimoire books go themselves, probably the one that you could dive into without a lot of confusion it's called Secrets of the Magical Grimoires, and that's by Aaron Leitch. And Leitch is his last name,
Okay.
Aaron Leitch. And he's kind of done what I've done, where he's done a cursory review of a lot of the grimoires and how they work, and making sense of a lot of the confusing parts or inaccurate translations that are out there. And that's available even in paperback. I would say foundationally, Agrippa, the astrological books by Nick Campion, Manny Palmer Hall's Secret Teaching of All Ages are the foundational text to understand what's going on. But then if you want to then just jump right into Grimoires as a book by itself, The Secrets of Magical Grimoires by Aaron Leitch is fantastic.
That is incredible. And you just like know those off the top of your head. Um, would you be willing to share an email address in case folks have any questions for you or would like to reach out to you? Or
I have a site on academia.edu that's actually from when I was doing grad study stuff and a little bit time afterward. And I apologize that nothing on there is current because I'm not really currently like hustling the way I was back in 2014. So it was a 10-year-old kind of site, but a lot of the stuff is on there, and you can find my thesis work that's called The Conjurer's Toolkit 1400 to 1800 Ciphers, Images, and Magical Cultures of Power Within the Solomonic Grimoires. Huge mouthful of a title, I know. But it's there, and it's free to read. And it's so academia.edu, and my name, Travis W. Shores, Shores. Strangely, academia.edu had me at top 1% for probably like 8 of those last 10 years. And I'm now still at the top 2% of all the academics that are on there for work that's cited. And I somehow ended up with 3 Google Scholar citations as well from other people still using my work. Now, normally in the academic world, nothing's good past 3 years. You want to have something that's relevant within the last 3 years. But because nobody else was touching these aspects the way I was, in the last 10 years, my work is still relevant to a lot of these people doing work on their PhDs and writing books and such. So if it's helpful to other people, I keep it up there for free and they can have at it as
that's
they wish.
fantastic. And we look at the Renaissance and the medieval period here, so you're always current with us.
Excellent.
Awesome. You're just like such a wealth of knowledge. I would love to have you back on again sometime for further discussion, just because you're just such a flippin' interesting guy to talk to with all these rabbit warrens.
Well, Yeah. I would love to come back and chat with you anytime. It's always a pleasure.
Oh, the same. Thank you. As with all topics we discuss here in the tavern, the opinions of our guests are just that, opinions of our dear guests, and may not always reflect the opinions of myself and the others here at the tavern. As we like to say, when you get 5 of us together in the tavern for a discussion, you'll end up with at least 8 different opinions, so your mileage may vary. Don't forget that Travis' research can be found on Google Scholar and on academia.edu, where you can find a PDF of the Conjurer's Toolkit 1400 to 1800. Just search under Travis W. Shores. I would also like to take a moment to remind you, dear friends, that as we enter this event season, that merchants love to be paid in the coin of the realm. That's cash. It may be difficult to obtain the connections necessary to use your MasterCard Lady Visa, Card of New Discoveries, or whatever card of your choice may be, but merchants will always accept your coin and money that folds. Our inspirational music, Vibrabimus, is used with permission by the amazingly talented Diabolis in Musica, the official minstrels of the tavern. They offer so much more than the dulcet tones that welcome our guests to the tavern. The travels of the Diabolis, Bazaar, and Sari party have taken them in search of the finest treasures inspired by the Silk Road. Their hand-selected wares include homeless saris ready to be adopted, shimmering silks with shiny shisha mirrors, jewelry and other bling things, and fresh made-to-order Turkish coffee. Look for the purple Vardo near the bathhouse at large events near you this summer. If you have the coin, they have the wares. So join us next month at the tavern to find out where our beloved anchoress is traveling next, to share a mazer or two of mead with witty, intelligent humor that brings light to the Dark Ages and revelry to the Renaissance. All found at the Time Traveler's Tavern. Like us, review us, and subscribe to us now on Podbean, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Player FM, Podchaser, or your favorite podcatcher, and never miss an episode.